Hello there, Mad Mike here, and welcome back to the channel. And today I want to talk about something that it's a bit of a broad subject, but I'm going to use an example that I've been seeing lately in the news for a reason for it. And the thing is that recently it's been put out that the people who have made It Chapters 1 and 2 are experimenting with ideas to do a third film. Now, whether the third film would be a prequel or a sequel would be completely up in the air, and whether or not it's going to be greenlit would be completely up in the air. This is just general discussion at this point, since It Chapter 2 did have a bit of meddling reviews when it came in. So, but here's the thing, is that, and this goes back to a point, is the idea that when is it when should you stop? When should you stop doing something? When should you stop pushing it before you narratively corrupt the product? And I think that It Chapters 1 and 2, it's probably a good idea to stop there because you are going a little bit downhill after 1 because 2, again, was not as well received, even though it did make a good amount of money. But you can see this with other things, Marvel continuing after Endgame, or various other franchises that have they've jumped the shark. Essentially, that's the term that's used most often, and it kind of brings up this idea that Hollywood needs to learn when to stop. And this goes back to a few different ideas that I've been saying in a lot of my videos, with the idea of Hollywood, that their whole idea of going forward is to build franchises and this and that. And we've seen it. I think maybe the most drastic example is Star Wars. Star Wars had 6 films before Disney acquired it, and then they decided they wanted to make a sequel trilogy. And obviously that sequel trilogy has not worked out to date, and it probably will not work out, period, in addition to the spin-offs and various other things. Now, George Lucas, I think, had the right idea, was stopping after the prequel trilogy and saying, that's enough, it's a complete story, we see the complete arc here, and it's done. We don't need to do any more. And I think that was a generally good idea. And then he just started doing stuff like filling in the gaps, and there was a few stuff from the distant past, and we did have some sequel stuff in terms of comic books and regular books and comic books and other media material and video games and stuff. But never in a theatrical, or never in what I would say would be an official sense, in terms of the canon. But Hollywood seems to have this idea that they can carry things forward and they can still make money off of them without altering them in any way. And we can see this in kind of with the Marvel formula, where now they think that they have a formula where all the films are starting to become a bit more generic and a bit more melded together, and there's less differences in the film. Now, they have stated that they might want to change that moving forward, but if they were to keep doing that, I think you're going to see diminishing returns from them, because audiences are going to get tired of it eventually. You get tired of the same thing over and over and over again if you keep getting shown it. And you can see this a lot with horror, where horror, in a lot of cases, very long-running franchises are run into the ground by studios because they simply run out of ideas, but they still want to make a movie. And here's the thing. If you're making a sequel to a film, and this is 2 rules that I have that should be whenever I see a sequel being made for a film. And or 2 check boxes, basically. If you can check these 2 boxes, then making a sequel is a good idea. If you can only check one, or if you can't check either, you shouldn't be making a sequel. Now, the first check is that there is room in the story to expand it to a point where you can make a sequel. If it is a very self-contained story and there's nothing to make a sequel out of, you probably shouldn't make that sequel. I think a really good example of that is Pacific Rim, where the first film wraps everything up almost perfectly. You don't need the second film at all, but they decided to make it anyway, and it's it's not really that good. I kind of enjoyed it just because I like the giant robot fights, but aside from that, I don't really think it was a very good film. Like I said, objectively, I don't think it's a good film, even though I kind of liked it. And so there really wasn't any area to expand the story in that sense. And ultimately it hurt the film because it felt like it was forced. Now, the second checkbox is, does the sequel take away from the original? And that's kind of the checkbox that I go to with an example of like Blade Runner 2049, is the idea that the first film, even though you could expand on it, doing so takes away some of the mystique of the first movie. Now, if you did like an anthology or something like that, something that's set in the same universe but didn't really apply to those original characters, I think you might have been better off doing something like that, where you didn't bring Harrison Ford and Sean Young and those characters back in. But in order to, you know, you take away from that first film by eliminating some of that mystique, because ultimately the ambiguous stuff in that film is really what makes it so timeless. So the idea, is Decker a replicant? Will what's going to happen with him and Rachel? What is she going to live forever, and is he going to die an old man? Or something going to happen here? It's the questions that don't necessarily need to be answered for the narrative perspective, but they leave a lot of things open to your own interpretation. Now, some films can do that, some films can't. I think Blade Runner is a film that can. And I think making the sequel 2049 only takes away from the original film. So if you don't have both of those check boxes checked off, in the sense that it doesn't take away from the original and it expands on the story, and you have room to expand on the story, then that's where it can work. And I think that's what you see in a lot of really good franchises. The Star Wars trilogy, the original trilogy anyway, where Empire and Jedi expanded on the original film, and they did not take away from it. They only added to it. You can see that with Indiana Jones. You can see that with some of the horror franchises. It's a little bit less so with those, because they're not as narratively sound in certain aspects as science fiction or dramas or adventure movies. But when you do stuff like that, if you try to force and I've been over this a little bit before, when you try and force a franchise, it doesn't usually work, because audiences a lot of the times can tell that you're trying to force things. They can tell that this thing was made for money, that it's soulless, that it really had nothing behind it other than the fact people wanted to make money out of a popular franchise. And you can see it in other things. Right now they're trying. There's word going around about a new Harry Potter film that might be based off of the play. I believe it's The Cursed Child or The Marked Child, something like that. I can't remember the exact name of it, but there's push right now where they're trying. They think they might be trying to make a movie out of that. And ultimately, that's a bad move, because you've jumped the shark. If you make that movie, you have jumped the shark with that franchise, because the original, I believe it was 8 films, put that story just fine. You can leave it as is, and you can leave it where it lies. It's fine. You don't need to carry on from that point. You had your climax, you had your ending, you had your definitive ending, and you don't need to keep it going from there. But again, Hollywood sees a moneymaker, they see a franchise, and they want to exploit it. The problem with this, again, is that narratively you drive these franchises into the ground where they can't explore any new ground at all, and eventually you get it to the point where people are soured on the franchise, and you've ultimately taken things away from those earlier films. And that's the problem that we're seeing now, again, with stuff like Star Wars, where you see the sequel trilogy. Luke Skywalker's a begone has-been, Princess Leia and Han Solo, separated, their son's a homicidal maniac. you know, stuff like that. We want to remember the end of Return of the Jedi. We want to remember, hey, the Empire got defeated, and Luke's going to go off and do his Jedi thing now and train more Jedi, and Han and Leia wind up together and all this shit. We want to remember that stuff. We don't want to see all of them. It's kind of the idea, and this is I forget where this quote comes from, but the idea that every story is a tragedy if you carry it on too long, if you carry it on long enough, and the idea that eventually everybody will die. Everybody dies, or bad shit happens, and the idea of the Hollywood happy ending is you leave it off there because that's where you want it to be left off. That's the last thought you want the audience to have of those characters, as opposed to carrying it forward and maybe seeing some more trials and tribulations with those characters that might not leave you with as satisfying of an ending. And that is that's kind of the core of what that quote means. And I think that they've carried Star Wars. I'm using Star Wars as an example quite a bit, but because they've carried Star Wars to the point where it's been to, we've now moved into the point where the original trilogy, if you consider the entire narrative, is not as fulfilling as it was, because now you know where these characters wind up, and you know that basically everything that they did means nothing because the First Order is still around and all this other shit. So it's a problem when you don't have good narrative storytelling, or when you've run the narrative well dry and you can't carry it forward, and the only reason why it is moving forward is because of money. And ultimately, I'm not an idiot. I realize that the entertainment industry is an industry first and foremost, as opposed to, the money comes first, and the money is the bottom line. The narrative takes a back seat. I get that, but the thing is that audiences are attracted more to a good narrative than they are to blind, flashy bullshit. You can see that with the Transformers franchise, where when the narrative went in the trash after the second movie, they started making less and less and less money. And it was really only with the Bumblebee film, that was not directed by Michael Bay and not written by Michael Bay, that you saw an infusion in the franchise and people kind of liked it again. And you got away from that, Michael Bay-esque, writing and humor and all that stuff that was very cringy and not very popular. And because of Bumblebee, now people are saying, like, okay, maybe you can carry on from here, or you can do different things. Um, but I'm not 100%. I'm not 100% sure if they can actually salvage the Transformers franchise. But it's a good it's a good cautionary tale to show for something like this, where narratively you drove it into the ground. You tried to go all these different places and it didn't work, and you just kept going and going and going, and then finally, when you get some fresh blood into the system, when you get somebody else who's not directing and writing these movies, then you can actually get a decent product, because you can add to something in a meaningful way, and it doesn't destroy the original idea of the films. Um, so that's just really my point to take away from this, is if there's a sequel to something, it should have some form of a purpose. It should expand upon the original story, and it shouldn't take away from the first film. And if it does either one of it, if it does both of those things, and it does them well enough, then generally you have a good sequel. However, if you can't do both of those things, or can only do one and not the other, generally your sequel is going to be lackluster. It is not going to be good. So that's just something to kind of take away from this. I really, as far as It Chapter 3 goes, I think it's a bad idea, because now you're going away from the source material, you're going away from the book, and you're going to have to try and make stuff up on your own. And I don't think that I don't think that the people that are going to be behind that are going to be able to do it to a good enough degree to make it a good horror film, because I think that unless Stephen King himself were to do it, I don't think that fans would react very well to it. I think that people will immediately judge it as a cash grab, because it's the studio pushing forward with this idea, and they've now gone to the point where they're beyond where the books were, or where the book was. So that's just kind of my opinion on it, but I want to know your opinion. What do you think about franchises and the whole idea of pushing something to the point where it's gone too far, or pushing something beyond the point where it should have ended? Put your thoughts in the comments. Again, I'd like to know what you're thinking. Hit the like button, hit the bell notifications, subscribe, and remember, I live my life free of compromise. Do you?